Hello everyone, Chris Felix here with the Nova Scotia Scholastic Chess Association, and today we're going to be going over the answers to the three puzzles that were given out at the 2020 season kickoff, with a little bit of analysis and some thought process ideas in there as well. So, hope you enjoy. Here we go. So this was the first puzzle that was given out during the tournament. If you haven't solved it yet, feel free to just pause the video and work out a solution, and then resume the video when you're ready. Okay, so we knew this position was white to play and checkmate. In a real game, we're never going to know for sure whether we can or cannot checkmate our opponent or could look for a checkmate. Our opponent doesn't stand up and say, oh, you can checkmate me. So I want to first talk about what about this position would lead me to think I may be able to checkmate my opponent? Well, one of the things you do when you're looking at attacking an opponent's king, or if you're being attacked by the opponent, is to count the number of potential attackers against the number of potential defenders. So in this position here, we can see white's got, I would say, 3 potential attackers. The queen is very close to the king. There's multiple ways that the king can be attacked. This rook can check the king right away. This other rook, there's multitudes of ways that this rook could get in and attack the king. So we have 3 potential attackers. That's not even including these pawns that may be able to rush up the board really quickly. What about the number of defenders for black? I'm not going to count the king as a defender because the king is the target of the attack. So we know that this black rook defends the pawn on f7. So that's pretty much one defender, and that's on the f7 square. g7 and h7 have no other defenders except for the king. This rook may be able to come up and defend. The knight doesn't seem to be able to get over here fast enough. There's no easy route to start defending the pawns in front of the king. We can also see that the black queen is off on the queen side, and it's very difficult to get back to defend the king. I mean, this pawn is in the way, so you'd have to kind of come back this way and then make additional moves. So black doesn't necessarily have the time to bring defenders against the king, whereas white has many attackers right away. So, okay. So now that we know that we may have a checkmating idea here, and of course, the puzzle told you, so how do we go about calculating this? I always start with forcing moves. So I look for checks first and see if the checks do anything. So in this position, we have 2 checks. The queen takes f7 check and rook takes g7 check. So those are the first 2 moves that I would calculate. So let's say I play queen takes f7 check. Okay, if the king moves, you can only move to this square, look at the checks again, and we'll see that it's checkmate. Well, that's really good. So we know that if the king moves to h8, queen takes g7 would be checkmate. But what else could our opponent do? Of course, they could take our queen with the rook. Okay, so are there any other checkmating ideas here? Now it's looking like we've added another defender to the king, and I'm not so sure that white can do anything from here. These rooks are not coordinated fast enough to checkmate. So that didn't quite work out. So queen takes f7, checkmated in one line, but if our opponent just takes our queen with the rook, it doesn't work. So now let's try the other check. Rook takes g7 check. Okay, well, our opponent has 2 ideas. They can take the rook, or they can move to h8. Let's see what happens if they take the rook. Okay, so now we get to this position here, and there's quite a few checks still. There's queen check on f6, queen check on g5, on g4, on g3. There's a queen check on h6, and there's a rook check on g1. So which one should we try? I'll let you think about that for a second. Okay. Well, I'm going to try rook to g1 check. The king cannot move here because of the queen, cannot move here because of the rook, and cannot move here because of the queen, and cannot move back because of the rook. So we've locked off a lot of squares that the king can move to. Notice how, as we said earlier, none of the other pieces can come over and block. The king just has no defenders. So the king has to go to the h8 square. Now, we check all of the checks, and there is one of them that is checkmate. Queen f6, checkmate. So we know that if the king takes the rook, rook to g1, king has to go to h8, queen f6 is checkmate. So we know that if our opponent takes the rook, we have checkmate. But is there anything else our opponent can do? Yes. We said they can move to h8, king h8, and we have to analyze this line as well. Well, I always check the checks first. We've got two checks. Well, what happens if we check here? King takes. Check. Has to move the king somewhere. Check. Looks like the king's starting to escape. Don't like that too much. Might have been able to chase it down. Not so sure. What about this check? Rook takes. Doesn't look like there's much of a way to checkmate here either. We have a check, then block. We could attack, and black could defend. That doesn't quite seem to work either. So maybe the checks aren't the right way to go here in this position. Well, can I make any direct threats? Can I threaten checkmate in one? Can I bring more pieces into the attack? I can. Queen to h6, threatening queen takes h7 checkmate, and black has no defenders to bring over. So just as a recap, the correct answer is rook takes g7 check. If the king takes, rook g1 check, followed by queen takes f6 is checkmate. And if the king goes to h8, simply queen to h6. No matter what black moves, your next move will be queen takes h7, checkmate. And that's the solution to the first puzzle. So here's the second puzzle that was giving out during the tournament. Same as before, if you haven't solved it yet, feel free to pause the video to work out your solution, and then resume the video when you're ready to see what the answer is. Okay, so in the first puzzle, we focused a lot on the weakness of the king because we knew it was a checkmate puzzle. This one, we're going to start out just looking at the general weaknesses in the position. So first, we're going to notice that this rook in the corner on a8 is weak because it's not defended by anything. And you can actually get at the rook through the diagonal. So there's a way to get at and attack the rook. We know the king is weak because the king can be checked or is accessible. One of the ways is the diagonal, and the other way is along the back rank. However, the back rank seems to be defended by the rook. Another thing in this position that's important to note is that the bishop is pinning the knight to the queen. So there's a few different things that we may be able to use here in this position to win some material. So as I said before, I always like to check the checks first, because if the checks work, it's forcing, then there's no need to look at anything else. So I see two checks in this position. One is queen to d5, and one is queen to d8. Let's first look at queen to d8 check. Okay, we've gotten to check the king. However, there's many different ways our opponent could take the queen. And if our opponent just takes it with the rook, I'm not seeing much else that could be done here, and now we've just lost our queen. So probably not the right solution. Let's look at queen to d5 check. Okay, this is looking okay. We're checking the king, and we're at the same time attacking that undefended rook. So that's a fork. That's good. So if our opponent moves the king, then we get to take the rook for free. Unfortunately, looks like our queen can be taken by the knight. Oh, but it was pinned. So now I could take the queen. But now the knight can take the bishop, and we'll see that I've got a rook, my opponent has a rook, but my opponent also has a knight. So we've ended up losing material there. Okay. So queen to d5 is a fork against the king and the rook, but the knight is defending it. If only the knight wasn't there, this would work. Okay, so let's try and remove the defender. What if I just take the knight? Now the knight's not there. If my opponent takes back with the queen, now I play check. My queen is completely safe. The king's in check. My opponent blocks. I take the rook with check. Now we can see that we both have queens, except I've got the extra rook. Okay, and if my opponent just moves the king somewhere, same thing. I'll take the rook with check. We both have queens, but I have the extra rook. All right, is there any other way my opponent could take back? Well, if they take with the pawn, check. It looks like the exact same thing. My opponent can't move the rook to block the check, and the rook's undefended. So no matter where the king moves, I'll take the rook, and then I'm still going to be up a rook. What if my opponent doesn't take the bishop, though? What if they just move the queen out of the way, like here? Okay, so in this case, I don't have the check fork anymore, but I did take my opponent's knight, and I've still got my bishop, so I'll just move my bishop out of the way. Now, both me and my opponent have a queen, both of us have rooks. However, I still have the extra bishop, and I've won material. So as a recap, the answer is bishop takes f6, and whether my opponent runs away or takes back, I'm either going to maintain up a bishop or up a rook, which would win material. So this was the third and final puzzle that was given out during the tournament, which is an endgame position of how white can win this endgame. Same as the previous two positions, if you didn't get to solve it during the tournament, feel free to pause the video now to work out your solution, and then resume the video when you're ready to hear the answer. Okay, so this endgame position is very interesting. Both sides have only one pawn, and then they're kings. So how does one side have an advantage over the other? Well, to understand this, we have to understand how the kings can fight against each other. And that is using something called opposition. So we're going to review what opposition is. So let's just set up a slightly different position here to understand exactly what opposition is. Okay, so I've just put two kings on the board, no other pieces, to show how this concept works. So we'll notice that the kings are facing each other with exactly one square in between. This is our standard direct opposition position. And how this works is the side to move is the side that does not have the opposition. So if it is black to move in this position, we say white has the opposition. If it is white to move in this position, we say black has the opposition. Okay, so why is this important? What can we possibly do with this? Well, let's say it's black to move. Remember, that means white has the opposition. There are two things you can do with the opposition. One is to block forever, and the other is to run around or outflank. So if we notice this here, since it's black to move, I want to highlight that the black king is almost creating a barrier in front of the black king. So the black king, if it wants to stay on the same rank, can only move left or right. So let's say if the king moves here. Oh, let's make it black to move. There. Black moves there. Well, let's say white wishes to block forever. White can do that because white has the opposition, so white just moves here. We get that same barrier in front of the black king. Moves here, you block. Moves here, you block. Moves here, you block. And you can do this forever, and there's nothing black can do to stop this or get around this. Even if black moves back, you just stay in this direct opposition forever. The black king can never make progress or can never run around. Now let's go back and say that the black king moved here again. Remember I said there was two options if you have the opposition. One was to block forever and the other was to run around. Well, now we can see that the black king is kind of creating this barrier. But we can run around. So I'm going to move here. We can see that I've actually moved up a rank against my opponent. If they move back here, well, we can take that direct opposition again. No matter which way they move, I can run around in the opposite direction. And I can continue to do that, no matter which way they move. If they move this way, I run around that way. If they run this way, then I run around that way. And it allows you to get into your opponent's position, even when it's just king against king. So now let's go back to that original endgame position we had up. Okay, so we have to figure out how to get into our opponent's position. It is white to move, and if I can win this pawn, then I'll have an extra pawn, and I can promote that, and then win the game. So what happens if I just move up here? Well, our opponent can play here and take that direct opposition. Notice that the kings are facing each other, and exactly one square in between. That means I cannot get into the position because my opponent has opposition, because it's me to move. That means I've got nothing to do. I can try all I want. There's no way that I could possibly get into the position. Even if I run around this way, my opponent could just always stop me. So that didn't work too well. Okay, so I don't want to go to this square because my opponent will take the opposition. All right. What if I move to this square, though? Let's try this one. That's starting to also make progress in my opponent's position. Okay. So let's say they move here. They're trying to come over and stop me. Oh, now I move here. It's the same position as before. The kings are facing each other with one square in between. However, this time it's black to move, which means I have the opposition. So if my opponent runs this way, well, now I move here, I'm running around, and I'm going to take the pawn and then win the game. So my opponent can't run that way. But what if they run this way? Okay, well now I'm going to run around the opposite direction, this way. And we can see that I'm starting to create this barrier against my opponent's king by using the pawn and the king together. And I'm going to try to march over and take this pawn. So how's my opponent going to stop me? If they play here, well, that didn't stop me from taking the pawn very well. So our opponent has to think what they're going to do here. And generally, they'll move to this square. And I'll show you why. If I step closer to the pawn, now they're protecting the pawn. But that's okay. I can take the opposition sideways, create this barrier. Our opponent moves. I step closer to the pawn. It's kind of like a zigzag formation. We're going to zig, zag. Actually, I think it was more this way. We're going to zigzag our way towards the pawn. Our opponent plays here. They're still defending the pawn. Move up. And now we've created the barrier enough that there's no moves the black king can make and still protect that pawn. Now in this position, I have the extra pawn, and it looks difficult because our opponent now has the opposition. The kings face each other. There's one square in between, but now it's my side to move. But that's okay. When the king is on the 6th rank, we can still win. I'll just move to the side and then push the pawn, and we squeeze the king out. The king has to move, protect the promotion square, and then we have a king and queen against a king, which is a winning endgame. So just to go back and recap, the correct answer is king to c5, and then zigzagging your way into the position until you win this pawn. If you chose king to d5, it doesn't work. If black plays properly, they'll take the opposition, and there's no way that you can win this game from this position. So I hope you've enjoyed the analysis and solutions that went along with these 3 chess puzzles that we gave out during the tournament, and we'll have more of these coming up. We hope to see you at our next event.